Thank you so much. Thank you everyone so far. This has been absolutely amazing. It is
Yeah.
just getting dark here in the UK, and I've had to put my lights on, which means that I now look like a washed out ghost. But it's okay. We'll just go with the spooky. I'm really excited to introduce Justin Nathaniel today. Justin is a PhD candidate in the Department of Humanities at York University. His research examines the shared moral and performative terrain of professional wrestling and populist politics, focusing on how transgression, spectacle, and moral conflict structure both audience reception and political identification. His presentation, Anatomy of a Heel, examines how the concept of heat in wrestling can help us better understand the appeal of transgressive figures in contemporary political culture. I'm really excited to hear your presentation, Justin. So I'm going to let you crack straight on. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, everybody. Really great presentations I've got to see. Just this sort of the tail end. Regretfully, I missed the first half of this conference. I was scrambling to put together this PowerPoint, which I'm now scrambling to find how I share it. Do I just do the share screen?
Yep, that'll work.
Okay. All right. So let's do this. See if this is working.
Perfect.
Looks good. Can you hear me?
You bet.
All right, perfect. Okay, so again, thank you very much. My name is Justin. The title of my presentation is Anatomy of a Heel, Nick Fuentes and the Transgressive Politics of Heat. What I want to do today is take a concept from professional wrestling, the heel, and use it to think more carefully about how outrage works in contemporary politics. So, in contemporary analysis, or contemporary political analysis, I should say, we often reach for familiar categories like populist, demagogue, or extremist to describe figures who provoke outrage and attract devoted followings. These terms capture something important, but they tend to treat transgressive behavior as either a symptom of ideology or a breakdown of norms. What they do not fully explain is how that transgression functions as performance, and why it can generate not only condemnation, but admiration and support. In 2025, Oxford named RageBait its word of the year, defined as online content deliberately designed to provoke anger in order to drive engagement. Wrestling audiences, however, have long recognized this dynamic under a different name, generating heat. This presentation proposes that professional wrestling offers a more precise analytic vocabulary for understanding this dynamic. In particular, I focus on the concept of the heel, not as a synonym for villainy, but as a specific mode of performance oriented towards provoking audience reaction. Using Nick Fuentes as a case study, I argue that what appears as moral deviance within mainstream narratives can function as a form of performative signaling for audiences who reject those narratives, effectively converting heel heat into oppositional forms of support. Under conditions of institutional distrust, the very outrage directed at such figures does not simply marginalize them, but can itself be interpreted as evidence of authenticity. This becomes visible in moments where condemnation increases rather than suppresses engagement, as audiences read backlash as confirmation rather than disqualification. But first, a note on terminology. So the term heel, it's been used frequently as a sort of synonym for villain. We've seen many articles on Trump that describe him as a heel. Of course, he is obviously a heel. Last year, there was a great presentation on Elon Musk as the chicken shit heel by two phenomenal presenters. So it's been used analytically before, but what I want to do is sort of propose something a little different. Okay, so if we're going to use the term heel, or if the term heel, is going to be used analytically, I think it has to retain some of its specifically wrestling-derived meaning. It cannot simply function as a colorful substitute for villain, bad guy, or antagonist. If we're going to use wrestling terms, they should retain and reflect the conditions of their origin. So in pro wrestling, a heel is not just someone who occupies the negative moral position within a narrative, like Joker or Darth Vader. Rather, a heel is a performer who knowingly adopts an antagonist persona designed to provoke an emotional reaction. So this is important to remember because it preserves what is distinctive about wrestling's contribution to political analysis. Wrestling does not just give us another word for evil, it provides us with a framework for understanding antagonism as something staged, exaggerated, and deployed specifically to elicit audience response. So the heel is defined not only by opposition to the babyface, but by its relationship to the audience. A conventional villain can exist entirely within narrative frames. A heel cannot. The heel's task is to generate heat, that is, an emotional response in the form of hostility, outrage, fascination, or vocal disapproval from the crowd. This antagonism does not always take the same form. In some cases, it's loud and verbal, and like in the case of Ric Flair. In others, it's conveyed through presence, dominance, or aesthetic cues, like the monster heel archetype, seen with someone like Brock Lesnar or Kane. There are many different subtypes of heels, but what remains consistent or constant, however, is the orientation toward producing audience reaction. Heat is not simply a byproduct of heel performance, but the mechanism through which its meaning is produced and circulated. This is what makes heel performance irreducibly public. Villainy can exist without an audience. Without an audience, however, there is no heel in the wrestling sense. The heel depends upon reception. Its meaning emerges not only from what it does, but from how others are made to react. The heel is best understood then as a mode of performance, not as an archetype. Taken together, these distinctions allow us to define the heel analytically as the self-conscious deployment of an abrasive, inflammatory, or disruptive persona for the purpose of eliciting an emotional response from the audience. This definition preserves the wrestling-specific dimensions of the term. It also gives us a more precise vocabulary for analyzing public figures whose appeal cannot be captured simply by calling them villains, demagogues, or provocateurs. The value of the term heel lies in the fact that it draws our attention to the performative production of outrage and to the audience's constitutive role in that process. This recalls Roland Barthes' understanding of wrestling as a spectacle of excess, where meaning is not subtle but amplified and exaggerated within the performance. The heel in this sense is not simply immoral, but performing immorality, making audience reaction both inevitable and essential. At the same time, there are clear limits to importing wrestling terminology into political analysis, and those limits should be stated clearly. In addition to provoking audience response in wrestling, the heel's primary function is to help build the babyface. The heel is almost always tethered to another performer whose moral legitimacy is strengthened through that antagonism. Right? Hulk Hogan needed Roddy Piper, Austin needed McMahon, Cena needed Edge, as you can see here, and so forth. Right? So the structure is comparatively stable and embodied. Politics, however, is less tidy. Here, the heel is not always attached to a single heroic opponent. Instead, heel performance is mediated through broader structures of norm enforcement and narrative construction, especially the news media and dominant cultural norms. In this context, the babyface is not necessarily a person, it often is a diffuse position of moral authority. This is not to say that we should avoid applying wrestling terminology to the political realm. At this point, it's common sense. As Sharon O'Brien argues in her account of the kayfabe presidency, figures like Donald Trump draw directly from the rhetorical repertoire of professional wrestling, blurring the line between performance and political reality. Both wrestling and politics increasingly operate through similar performative logics. With that in mind, we can now turn to a concrete example of how this dynamic operates in practice. Let's take the example of Nick Fuentes, an American far-right political commentator and live streamer whose notoriety stems not only from the content of his views, but from the abrasive and inflammatory style in which he delivers them. He is a highly online figure with a dedicated following, and he operates at the intersection of political commentary, internet culture, and provocation. Fuentes provides a useful example because he is not only controversial in a general sense, but specifically narrativized as morally repugnant within mainstream news discourse. In outlets such as the New York Times or the Washington Post, he's presented through labels like neo-Nazi, anti-Semite, racist, misogynist, or Hitler sympathizer. Needless to say, these are not neutral descriptors. They function as moral cues that position him as someone to be rejected and condemned. In this sense, the media does not simply describe deviance, it stages it within a moral narrative structure. And within that framing, Fuentes, of course, appears as the heel, while the corresponding babyface is not an individual hero, but the moral authority of respectable society itself. This framing, however, is not imposed on Fuentes from the outside alone. He actively performs into it. Fuentes deliberately presents himself in ways that the dominant media and mainstream culture will register as offensive and beyond the pale. The key point is that this condemnation is not an unintended consequence of his speech, but part of the performance itself. Much like MJF, who leans into crowd hostility to provoke stronger reactions, Fuentes adopts a style that invites repulsion and amplifies it. What a wrestling framework adds is a clearer account of how such staged violations generate audience reaction, or what we call heat. Importantly, this antagonism does not diminish his visibility, rather it sustains it. Now, this dynamic is increasingly visible within what has been described as the attention economy, where visibility is conditioned by engagement rather than agreement. What is now called rage bait is, in wrestling terms, simply the production of heat. Figures like Fuentes are therefore not merely expressing controversial views, but operating within a media environment in which provocation itself becomes a form of currency. In both cases, outrage is not a side effect, rather it's the point. Now, the effectiveness of this moral framing depends upon the legitimacy of the institutions producing it. That legitimacy, however, has been increasingly unstable. Since at least the Trump era and the popularization of the term fake news, mainstream media has been subject to sustained public distrust and contestation. For many on the populist right, the press no longer appears as a credible moral referee, but as a compromised partisan actor. Whether one accepts this assessment is beside the point analytically. What matters is that a substantial part of the audience does. And this dynamic does not apply universally, but it becomes possible where audiences already perceive the media as illegitimate and untrustworthy. Under those conditions, media condemnation no longer straightforwardly secures moral consensus. Instead, it can intensify identification with the condemned figure. And this is where the wrestling framework becomes especially useful. When the institution generating condemnation is itself distrusted, heel heat can be reinterpreted rather than simply accepted. For audiences already alienated from the mainstream, media outrage does not confirm that Fuentes is morally wrong. It confirms instead that he is challenging the right enemies. In wrestling terms, the crowd is no longer aligning with the promoted moral order, but reassigning its allegiance based on its own reading of that performance. What appears from one perspective as repugnant norm violation can appear from another as evidence of candor, fearlessness, and authenticity. Right. Just had a look at the chat, sorry. Okay. Wrestling offers another important insight here, namely the bifurcated lens through which audiences evaluate performance. Fans can reject a heel at the level of narrative while still admiring the performer behind the role. Chris Jericho's 2008 character is a useful example. He was clearly positioned as a heel, but many fans still respected his intensity and commitment to performance itself. This dynamic helps explain how admiration can coexist with moral rejection. The performer can be over even when the character is positioned as the antagonist, a distinction that becomes analytically useful beyond wrestling itself. And Fuentes is definitely over. Okay, despite being banned from nearly all major platforms, a recent Washington Post article indicates that he has earned hundreds of thousands of dollars in the last year alone through live stream super chats, where viewers pay to have their comments read aloud. These are mostly small donations from his audience that pay for their comments to be read on screen. Even when he mocks or dismisses those contributors, they continue to support him. And this helps clarify Fuentes' appeal without endorsing his politics. Despite the odious substance of his views, he is a skilled speaker who understands cadence, provocation, humor, and timing. He often couches offensive claims in joking or shock jock form, which allows him to combine transgression with entertainment. That combination is central to his circulation online. Clips go viral not only because of what he says, but because of the audacity with which he says it. With which he says it. In wrestling terms, he is highly effective at generating heat. But because that heat is filtered through a context of distrust towards mainstream media institutions, it does not remain heel heat. For a sympathetic audience, it can be converted into identification and support. In that reversal, the figure constructed publicly as a heel comes to occupy a babyface position within an oppositional counter-public. Wrestling helps us see that this is not simply a matter of ideology, but of performance, audience reception, and contested narrative authority. Trump's political success demonstrated that transgressive performance could be electorally viable at the highest level of institutional politics. And we can think of Nick Fuentes as a younger, more online version of that style. I like to call him Trump without the wellness policy. Whereas Trump helped mainstream this performative style, Nick Fuentes intensifies it, operating within a similar repertoire of provocation and spectacle with remarkable success in this new digitized attention economy. So what the concept of the heel allows us to see is that transgression in politics is not simply a matter of breaking norms, nor is its appeal reducible to ideological agreement. It's a structured form of performance that depends on audience recognition, institutional mediation, and the broader credibility of those who enforce moral boundaries. By distinguishing the heel from the villain, we shift our focus from moral judgment to performative function. We can see how figures like Nick Fuentes do not merely express controversial views, but actively stage themselves in ways designed to generate outrage and circulate that reaction as part of their appeal. Under conditions where mainstream institutions retain authority, the heat reinforces marginalization. But where that authority is contested, the same heat can be reinterpreted as evidence of authenticity, converting condemnation into support. Wrestling has long understood this dynamic. Political analysis has been slower to account for it. Taking the heel seriously, then, is not about reducing politics to spectacle, but about recognizing that spectacle has already become one of the primary ways political meaning is formed and sustained. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Justin. That was really, really great and really interesting talk. Lots and lots to pull apart there. Just to sort of direct a question towards you and Tyler. Are you both still happy to take questions after Tyler's presentation, as I think that might be helpful just for people to like frame things, or do you want to go back to just having questions straight after yours, Justin?
It doesn't matter, whatever works for the organizers. Tyler can go ahead, or
then let's let Tyler go ahead, and then we will take questions at the end from everyone, because then that just gives you guys a chance to collect your thoughts, Justin a chance to collect his, and Tyler a chance to present. It is my pleasure to introduce Tyler Majer then. Tyler is a PhD candidate in the Cultural Studies programme at Trent University in Peterborough, Ontario. His research focuses on professional wrestling and its fandom, particularly in the amateur indie professional wrestling scene in Southern Ontario. His research incorporates fan studies, affect theory, and an autoethnographic methodology into an analysis of the audience-performer relationship within the art form and sport of professional wrestling. Thank you so much much, Tyler. Um, please enjoy.
Thank you. 1 second here. Oh no. No, no, no. I'm trying to share my screen and it's making me enter passwords. Can you see my screen yet?
Not yet.
Okay, here we go.
Perfect.
Perfect. Okay, present. Awesome. Well, everyone, yep. This is my presentation. It's called The Failed Wrestling Debut, Fandom, Gimmicks, and the Hate Sing. So I'll just get going. Wrestling fans expect a lot. For a multiple episode per week, never-ending television program, wrestling companies do a good job of keeping us engaged and entertained, even if we don't always agree with every booking change or title change, booking decision or title change. With that being said, sometimes elements of the program fail spectacularly and fall short of fan expectations in a way that isn't just fan nitpicking, but exists with obvious and egregious disappointment. This presentation will look to some of these debuts, specifically discussing this disappointment of certain debuts in wrestling history to try and understand how professional wrestling fans engage with the failed aspects of the art form they follow and love. The overarching argument for this short presentation is thus: when confronted with the failure of their beloved sport, wrestling fans isolate these specific moments as not representative of the art form as a whole, navigating around and reevaluating these failures as a sort of defense mechanism whereby their fandom can still exist but does not stand for or speak to the disappointment and failure that these moments evoke. Furthermore, it is through the construction of one's identity as a fan that the product itself becomes influenced by the engagement, whether negative or positive, that fans evoke in response to that which is presented to them. To put otherwise, wrestling fans are not stagnant consumers of the wrestling product. In fact, fans evaluate and construct their own interpretations of these failed performances, both actively and retroactively, looking to these moments as not just failures of the said moment, but as emblematic of issues with certain movements, eras, or companies that are bracketed and codified as symbols of a larger problem within wrestling history. By looking at three examples from professional wrestling history: the Shockmaster debut in WCW, the Gobbledygooker reveal slash debut in WWF, and Danhausen in post McMahon WWE. Oops, the chat. Da, da, da. Uh-huh. In post McMahon WWE, alongside some fan studies texts, this paper will aim to show just how fan identity is consolidated in response to the negative elements of wrestling programming, and how the performance of one's identity in relation to these perceived failures actually influences the product itself for hopeful change for the better. Fan studies offer some illuminative ideas regarding how fans consolidate identity in relation to their chosen subject of fanaticism. Henry Jenkins' seminal fan studies text, Textual Poachers, discusses the ways in which fans integrate their chosen texts into their identity as fans, but emphasizes that the power dynamics, or lack thereof, that fans have in relation to those that make the texts themselves is unequal and hierarchized. As Jenkins writes, fans must actively struggle with and against the meanings imposed upon them by their borrowed materials. Fans must confront media representations on an unequal terrain. While this may be true for the television fandoms in the era in which Jenkins was writing about, this is not really accurate for wrestling fandom, as interaction with the audience is a fundamental aspect of wrestling itself. Wrestling provides a space whereby audience input is not only an influence on the production, but is actually a key facet of the decision making around the product itself. When things falter, however, and irredeemably fail, wrestling fans do effective work to explain away and codify these failures presented to them as not representative of the fandom as a whole, in a sort of we like wrestling, but not that type of wrestling sort of rhetoric. As Jenkins writes, fans actively exert their mastery over the mass produced texts which provide the raw materials for their own cultural productions and the basis for their social interactions. In the process, fans cease to be simply an audience for popular texts. Instead, they become active participants in the construction and circulation of textual meanings. While Jenkins is speaking about fan creations that build on and take from one's objects of fanaticism, the idea of active participation that finishes this quote is true to wrestling fandom more broadly. In John Fisk's television culture, Fisk distinguishes television as a producerly text, whereby the text itself is open to change and reinterpretation through engagement from fans. Professional wrestling is also a producerly text, but is not producerly simply due to the televised nature of the art form as we know it, but has always been producerly in the way that audience engagement is a fundamental process of the performance itself. As Fisk explains, the producerly text does not produce a singular reading subject, but one that is involved in the process of representation rather than being a victim of it, thereby treating its readers as members of a semiotic democracy, already equipped with the discursive competencies to make meaning. The producerly nature of wrestling, then, is not only influenced by what fans like or take positively, but rather is formed, reproduced, and reevaluated also by what is regarded as a failure and derided by the fan community. What is interesting, then, for our purposes, isn't what fans like, but what they dislike, and therefore reject as a proper moment, element, or segment of programming, and how these moments retroactively become indicative and definitional of the failures of certain eras, companies, or moments within programming, while also being reacted to accordingly in their current moments as an immediate way of providing producerly feedback that resulted in contemporaneous programming changes. As Gray summarizes in his opening chapter from Melissa Click's collection on screen here, Anti-Fandom, Dislike and Hate in the Digital Age, speaking about Jenkins again, textual poachers catalogs and theorizes multiple instances in which fans like a text to a point but reject parts of the text and feel the need to renovate or cure these parts. In other words, they are fans of the text as a whole, yet also anti-fans of specific parts. Just because one is a fan of something does not mean that one must accept all aspects of what is presented to them. Gray continues, fandom never requires that one love absolutely everything about a text, and thus we should expect that many people who watch this or that television show may still have parts of the text that they abhor or dislike. For wrestling fans, however, this abhorrence of certain aspects of the programming becomes indicative of fan frustrations around certain productions of wrestling in certain moments in time. In fact, the knowledge of and dislike of certain moments in wrestling also comes to designate certain fans as good fans. As Jenkins writes, an individual's socialization into fandom often requires learning the right way to read as a fan, learning how to employ, comprehend the community's particular interpretive conventions. Okay, so the first example of a spectacularly failed debut that shows how fans reevaluate failed moments in wrestling history as a way of substantiating their own identity as good fans is the Gobbledygooker. For those not familiar with the Gobbledygooker, this debut and gimmick was built up the weeks prior to Survivor Series 1990 as a giant egg that appeared at the top of the entrance ramp on WWF/E programming, with the promise that the egg would hatch at Survivor Series 90. At the event, the egg did hatch, and the mystery inside was surprise Hector Guerrero in a giant chicken costume. Fans' negative reactions to this moment was immediate as boos and jeers rained down within the arena, with the only thing being able to sort of assuage these negative reactions being whatever Mean Gene and the Gobbledygooker, are doing in the ring. This character was not utilized much past this event due to this immediately negative backlash, and has since become a punchline for those good fans with the knowledge of this failed aspect of wrestling history. The disappointment and failure of this debut could very possibly have harmed wrestling fan identity, as they tried to make sense of what the hell was going on here, and potentially questioned the product as a whole and maybe their fandom as a whole. Because fans incorporate their programming of choice into their identity, a rift in the programming becomes a necessary rift to understand and conglomerate into their own lives. As such, fans utilize their critical, interpretive, and textual skills to expose, provoke, and revoke certain aspects of the programming itself to bracket and navigate their identity construction as fans. Fans of professional wrestling are also anti-fans that practice resistant or re-evaluative reading practices necessary to substantiating their fandom in opposition to these failed moments that are representative of the era, the company, the booking decision, etc. One more example of a spectacular failure from this era of the early 90s was the Shockmaster debut at WCW Clash of Champions 14, teased to debut as the final member of a War Games team of four that already consisted of Sting, Dusty Rhodes, and Davey Boy Smith. Fred Ottman, otherwise known as Tugboat or Typhoon in the WWF, was pumped up as a mysterious, promising, and powerhouse figure. The moment of his actual debut, however, saw Ottman costumed in a weird furry vest and glittery silver painted stormtrooper helmet, crashing through a pane of drywall and then tripping and falling on the floor, having his helmet fall off in the process. While he attempted to get up from this fall, a pre-recorded voiceover promo from the Shockmaster himself, which was actually voiced by Ole Anderson, started to play over the broadcast as the other wrestlers in the segment either struggled not to laugh or cursed in shock and frustration. This is often considered the worst debut in wrestling history. WCW Creative then tried to recast this character as a sort of clumsy comedic role to no avail. Fans never accepted the Shockmaster in any iteration, and Ottman was soon out of the company. So, just a quick pivot here. The trope of the hate sink I mentioned in the title, and I think it provides some insight to how these debuts are viewed as wrestling fans. The hate sink character is defined as a TV trope by tvtropes.org as a character created by the author with the express intention of being loathed by the audience. In the initial proposal for this presentation, I utilized this trope of the hate sink to try and potentially explain these failed moments. And I think that the Shockmaster debut and the Gobbledygooker can be looked at as hate sink-ish moments, and I think it is still useful for professional wrestling studies. I'm not sure as convinced now that it as accurately applies to these moments as I once was, thinking now that it might be more applicable to some category of heels within wrestling programming. That being said, the way in which these moments come to represent irredeemable aspects of these eras in professional wrestling history or the companies that put them on does still have a hate sinkish quality, but one that is defined not by the producers of the programming itself, but have been reevaluated as such by fans of the art form in a producerly fashion. While the hate sink as a trope usually speaks to authorial intention and the construction of the trope, the participatory nature of professional wrestling allows fans to have a hand in the interpretation of that which is presented to them. One may initially think of heels more generally as a hate sink in professional wrestling, but I also don't know if they're hate sinks as by the trope definition, because heels, despite their wickedness, often have redemptive qualities in their coolness factor, their performance, their persona. But these two aforementioned moments become hate sinks in a way as they represent a failure of the art form, and thus have very little or no redemptive qualities outside of maybe fan knowledge of their existence and the subsequent campy enjoyment of them, as evidenced by the fact that both of those failed people have wrestling figures. The way this differs from the hate sink, however, is that the moments mentioned here were presented in earnest by the companies that created them, and were not constructed specifically for the purpose of hate, but rather in the hopes of popularity, excitement, or engagement. These moments, however, have been reevaluated and adopted by fans in a producerly fashion as moments oppositional to good fandom. The hate sink here, then, is not one created by the powers that be, but rather has been reevaluated as such by fans in order to constitute and consolidate fan identification with the product as worthy themselves of the title of wrestling fan and knowledgeable of what makes for good wrestling programming more generally. Now, these first debuts are somewhat straightforward examples of how fans coalesce their feelings slash frustrations with certain moments into their already existing identity as professional wrestling fans, particularly as to the way that these moments come to be emblematic of the issues with the pro wrestling product at the time of the presentation. Continual reevaluative reading of text in the digital age, however, compounds this issue of fan engagement and production as readings of the text become an even more active process of re-identification. Currently, professional wrestling fan identity and its consideration of failures is less concerned with a knowledge of and stance in opposition to specific moments within the art form in the past, as it is with fan ability to reevaluate and continually reconsider their opinions of and response to moments and characters within the current state of pro wrestling. To crystallize this idea, one must only think of the initial reactions to Danhausen's debut at this year's Elimination Chamber to his incredible growing popularity and booming merchandise sales. From initially submitting this proposal till now, opinions of him as a character have changed drastically. Danhausen, whose debut was initially detested by fans, particularly in the internet wrestling community, has now become one of WWE's top merchandise sellers. Where in the past, good and knowledgeable fans were often expected to know or have a stance in relation to the failures of the art forms retroactively, fans in the digital age must still have a stance, but must also retain a flexibility in reevaluating their enjoyment of the product on a weekly, daily, hourly, or even minute by minute basis. So, to sum up, wrestling fans are fickle, but it is this fickleness that allows for the text itself to be influenced and evaluated for change. An article or piece on this topic that would expand this would look more closely at anti-fan studies, try to situate these reactions within literature that takes into account like digital or Web 3.0 reactions to more fan and anti-fan studies. For this presentation's purposes, however, I hope the takeaway to be that wrestling fans crystallize their identity as fans by situating their opinion on specific moments from within the intertextual universe of wrestling itself. But in a digital age, where constant contact with your object of fanaticism is the norm, a more constant reevaluation of how one stands in relation to these objects of fandom is necessitated. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tyler. These have both been amazing presentations. I can't believe we are so far into today and we are still being fed just such wonderful, rich, interesting, and exciting presentations and thoughts on wrestling that are so broad. This is incredible. So thank you so much, everyone. Let's get into it with some questions, so we. AC, I think you had one straight at the start. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I actually have two. One is for our first presenter. Sorry, Nathaniel. Sorry, I'm terrible with names in real life, and I've been talking a lot more than usual today. So I am unconnected questions. One for Justin and one for Tyler. All right, so. If you don't mind, I'd like to ask them separately. Firstly, for Justin, great presentation. Thank you for all of that. I wanted to ask for this one because this is a common point of discussion when someone is intentionally out in the world and behaving behaving badly. Folks will often point to this, say, "Oh, they're being a wrestling heel and attempting to get heat for this." The concern that I have, or the question that I have, is relating to that because in professional wrestling, the heel, their behavior is fictitious. The character is not real, and the individual who's engaging in that behavior is not actually committing these heinous acts. I'd point to a recent example where in AEW, Jon Moxley, as a character, has kidnapped several co-workers and attempted to murder them with bleach. Now, the actual person has not done this. But in your discussion of Nick Fuentes, we need to delineate that because there are actual Nazis who this person is attempting to appeal to. So how do we reconcile the fictitiousness of the characters of professional wrestling heels with the sort of progressive of ideals put forth by media characters like Fuentes and the real life harm that it can cause.
Okay, yeah, thank you, AC. Just you cut out just a little bit at the end there, but I think I got the gist of the question, and it's a good question. It's something that I've been grappling with because it's something that I noticed. There is this frequent, and you mentioned this too in the question, that when there are, these figures that pop up and they're doing objectionable things and they're saying objectionable things, like Trump, I mentioned Elon Musk, there was a presentation last year. They're called heels, and you mentioned that it's sort of there is this sort of recognition that there's a performance here, and I don't know that I always see that. I see mostly that we take heel bad guy and we say, okay, this person is doing something that we don't like, and therefore he or she is a bad guy. They are a bad guy. In my presentation, I just wanted to sort of highlight the performative nature of that, and further to show how outside of ideology, right? What you said is very true. Of course, Fuentes has garnered a large, a neo-Nazi type of white supremacist following. I would argue, though, that is not the full story, and is sort of as a form of evidence for that to show. I'm trying to show how his profile is continuing to rise, to increase, despite all types of bans and censorship. He is being platformed by non-neo-Nazi interviewers like Tucker Carlson, and he was on Piers Morgan, and he's on all these different podcasts. So there's a risk, I think, in missing the entire picture when we focus simply on ideology here, though that is, of course, a very important thing. In my presentation, I'm looking at the performance of a sort of a kind of troll, as a sort of provocateur, as itself being the attraction outside of ideology, right? So I do not want to assert that this is the only attraction or the only appeal of Fuentes, but that this sort of performance, and I do believe, you can look at through his live streams or his tweets, there is this a large element of performance that is attracting, that is attractive to a sort of a transgressive audience. And the work that I do in populist studies, I know I'm sort of rambling, I apologize for that. And the work that I do in populist studies, we've been looking at that for a few years, since at least the emergence of Trump. There are different sociocultural explanations for why, outside of a sort of political or rhetorical explanation for why a figure like Trump emerges. To look at what does this say about our sociocultural context? Why is it, outside of, say, simply agreeing with these, abhorrent and repulsive views, why are they attracting such attention, such admiration, such affiliation? So this, of course, brings me to wrestling. I think of everything through a wrestling lens, and this sort of this idea of heat, which is often unstable. Right? We saw this earlier in a presentation on Nikita Koloff, right? Who was a Russian forward heel menace, and who was actually talking about real events, in which real people were hurt or died, but through that performance, something happened there, and he became a baby face, right? And so that energy kind of got projected onto sort of the other moral side of things. So all this is to say, it's a long question and a longer answer, I apologize, is that, of course, I do acknowledge and recognize that there are actual, the stakes are higher, obviously, in the real world, in real world politics, than they are in the wrestling arena. However, using a wrestling lens, I hope that we can better understand these dynamics in order to, of course, better or more effectively respond or resist to them. So I hope that answers the question somewhat in some part.
Thanks so much, Justin. I just want to let Tyler jump in on this because he had his hand up, and I don't know if you wanted to weigh in there, Tyler, on anything.
Sure.
I think AC had a question for me, but I was just gonna say to Justin that I find the Nick Fuentes as heel or how he produces and gets engagement as Heat thing very interesting. I also just wonder though, in this current media age, how much of it also could just be like he's shocking and that's what gains traction. Like and he's very good at putting on a persona that is like memeified and that sort of like web 3.0 terminally online type of people. Like I have found that when he pops up, if he pops up on my Instagram for some reason and I watch one, I get like 20 of them, and there's something about him where you kind of want to be like, this feels ironic. This feels like you're doing an extra amount, like for the bit, as well as also like just being a terrible person. But I wonder how much of it is, I guess it's just a performance comment. I just liked your discussion of performance. I thought I had a question coming, and then I just let myself
No, you know
talking.
what, Tyler? Thank you so much for that comment. And it's something that I don't know if I hope that it didn't come through, but it's something I'm actively thinking about, right? This is a chapter that I'm working on. I'm really trying to think through this because it's a dicey subject. It really is. I'm not trying to endorse Nick Fuentes or advocate or say, or even say that anybody that is attention seeking in this manner is going to attract an audience. It's not simply to say that, all shocking behavior equals, some sort of affiliation. There's something a little different going on here. And again, my purpose, the way that I see it, is to better understand so that we can better resist. Right. So oftentimes when we sort of stick a label, he's from a basket of deplorables, and these people are abhorrent people. It's like, okay, yeah, but they're not going anywhere. Right, they're
Mm.
still here. It's like we need to sort of think of, maybe we do, maybe we don't. From my perspective, perhaps we need to think a little bit differently about why they're attracting their audiences. And like you said, of course, it is a huge part of this is this new attention economy, Web 3.0. The algorithms. They're pushing this. And then what happens though? When people start to sort of to listen to that and I don't know. Again, something that I'm actively thinking through, but I do appreciate the contribution in the comment. I don't want to take up any more time.
No worries. I appreciate it. Lisa, we're gonna wrap it up.
I think we do have to wrap it up. However, I really want people to keep this alive in the chat because I feel like there's still stuff that we're
Definitely.
kind of picking through together. AC had a question. I've got a couple of things I want to peek through. So, can we just take a moment to say a huge thank you and congratulations to Tyler, to Justin. Thank you for coming by. Thank you for being here and presenting. And I will hand back to Tanisha as we
Yeah,
professionally
absolutely.
know.
We could